This is the tutorial for project-based learning. What we're going to talk about tonight is really an extension of the topics we covered when we talked about performance tasks and making performance assessments. And I think a lot of the things that you learned in that class will definitely carry over and help you here with this introduction. So for me, project-based learning really is a love story in the sense that I've really, through the years, have fallen in love with this kind of teaching. So I want to kind of go back to the beginning for me because I think it says a lot about this as an instructional model and how sometimes these projects can actually exceed your expectations and turn into something really special. So I was teaching a ninth grade social studies class, and this was in the mid 1990s, and we were doing a Cold War unit. And by that time, it had become challenging to teach the Cold War because it had become kind of an irrelevant topic for the students. They were starting to get to the age where they couldn't remember. They didn't live through the Cold War. They couldn't remember the paranoia and the fear of war with the Soviet Union. So it was difficult to make the Cold War and the basic topics like the Cuban Missile Crisis and the Berlin airlift and the war in Vietnam, all of those things. It was becoming increasingly difficult to motivate students and engage them in those topics. So the first thing I did is I changed the focus of the Cold War unit and turned it into a murder investigation. The investigation of the murder of John F. Kennedy on November 22nd, 1963. So it became really an inquiry-based unit on that question, who killed John F. Kennedy? And all of the classic Cold War content, like the Cuban Missile Crisis, like the war in Vietnam, all those things were still going to be covered, but they were all going to be covered from the standpoint of evidence, factors, potential motives, conspiracies, all related to this very high interest question in this murder investigation. So if you think back to the class that we discussed motivation and using inquiry to motivate students, and we looked at the work of Mihai Csikszentmihalyi and Daniel Pink and talked about the importance of trying to get students into that psychological state of flow where time ceases to have any meaning and we just keep working. So one of the key ingredients there is autonomy, and that was something that I was really trying to embrace in this Who Shot JFK project. So rather than relying on textbook resources or even websites, although that was definitely part of the resource collection, I really wanted the students to have a lot more control over the resource process and a lot more autonomy. So we focused on eyewitness interviews. I was able to forge a partnership with the FBI and the CIA. I didn't have any contacts or anything. I actually just started out by dialing 411 and asking for the Federal Bureau of Investigation in Washington, D.C. Got bounced around a little bit, but eventually got to the right person. And they helped me set up a series of eyewitness interviews. We just used a basic speakerphone to do these interviews, but it really gave the students a lot of empowerment and control over the knowledge acquisition process and over their resources. So the first person that we interviewed, all the way on your left here, was retired Special Agent James Hosty. Now, James Hosty plays a very special part in this historical event. He was the FBI agent in Dallas in the early 1960s, and he was assigned to conduct surveillance on Lee Harvey Oswald and his wife Marina about a month before the assassination. He's an interesting figure because it's a fact that a week before the assassination, Oswald walks into the FBI headquarters in Dallas and demands to see Agent Hosty, who's actually not there at the time. When Oswald is told by the receptionist that Hosty's not there, Oswald quickly writes and scribbles in a note and gives it to the receptionist and asks her to give it to Agent Hosty. Now, after the assassination happens and Oswald is arrested and later murdered himself, once information comes out about that note, it becomes very important. When Hosty's later on asked for the note, he explains the note is gone. So this really becomes the center of a lot of questions, the Center of Accusations for Government Cover-Up, the Center for the Theories of Conspiracy, connecting Oswald with a federal agent and the federal government. The whole idea of the concept of did the federal government help Oswald kill Kennedy? So that was the first interview. He was fantastic. He actually was also the first person to interrogate Lee Harvey Oswald when he was arrested. So he gave the students a lot of details about the interrogation. He talked about surveillance on Oswald and what Oswald did in the months leading up to the assassination. In particular, Oswald's trip to the Cuban embassy in Mexico City, where he met with two KGB agents. So the students really found a lot of very interesting information about the investigation through that interview. Next, we talked to Dr. Paul Peters, who was one of several surgeons who worked on President Kennedy that morning in Dallas. Dr. Peters is actually the physician who officially pronounced Kennedy dead. This was kind of in some ways, the interdisciplinary aspect of the project, as Dr. Peters focused and answered students' questions about the physical condition of the president, the appearance of the president's wounds, what he felt were entrance wounds, exit wounds, etc. He even got into kind of the behind-the-scenes political aspects of what it's like being a surgeon trying to save the life of the President of the United States. So a very interesting interview. And then shortly after that, we interviewed an eyewitness, James Tague. Mr. Tague actually was in Dealey Plaza that morning when the president was shot, and he was actually hit with the first shot. Oswald fired 3 shots that morning. The first shot missed the president altogether, hit the sidewalk, the bullet fragmented and came up and hit Mr. Tague in the cheek. So James Tague was really a really good resource in answering the students' questions about proximities and location of the president and noises, shots that he heard, where he saw people running, his own perspective on where he thought the shots came from. So obviously that was very interesting to students. So what was great about this process is the students really had a great deal of control over the research process. And they also, I think, learned a lot about how to ask probing questions and how to conduct an interview in a very professional way. So tonight we're going to define the jump from performance assessment to project-based learning and explain the differences between those two things. We'll walk through some sample projects, and I will provide you with a very quick tool called the GRASP tool, which will allow you to create a framework for your own unit project. So by now you should be comfortable with the term performance assessment or performance tasks. This is something that we spent a class on, and you developed for your unit plan a performance task, and some of you actually developed several. So these are assessment experiences where we ask students to apply content and skills to some kind of authentic task, and it's a way for us to collect evidence on whether or not students have actually mastered concrete learning objectives. Typically, in a performance assessment scenario, we give students a role and some kind of goal and challenge for them to fulfill. We give them a rubric up front, which serves as a blueprint for success. It gives them our expectations and explains to them what they have to do to achieve at the various performance levels. These tasks are usually relatively small in scope and can be completed in one class, maybe 2. And typically, although there's no textbook definition of this, when we talk about performance assessment, we're talking about an individual student assessment. Now, the term project is slightly different. Now everything we're talking about here really is just for the sake of our conversation. These are not, again, things that you can look up definition in any kind of professional textbook. But in general, when people talk about projects, they're talking about something that really contains all of the elements of a performance assessment that we've just discussed, plus some. So in many ways, projects are performance assessments on steroids, in the sense that they tend to be larger scope and more complex. So much so that they are very difficult for a student to do individually. So it usually requires some kind of cooperative group. There usually are different phases in a project. One phase where students are doing research and acquiring knowledge, and another set of tasks where they're applying that knowledge. There can be multiple products and performances that are used for assessment throughout the project. And a lot of times when we hear project, we think about outside partnerships, kind of like the Who Shot JFK project that I talked about. So that was that in that particular scenario, we formed a partnership with first the FBI and the CIA, and brought a lot of expertise in as students were doing research, all working towards their final product, which in that case they were actually creating a mock trial of Lee Harvey Oswald. And as we said, projects are larger in size and scope, and they also tend to be interdisciplinary. When you think about performance assessments, you don't necessarily think about an interdisciplinary task. But when you're talking about a project, again, like the JFK one, that involved both social studies and elements of biology. And because of this, projects usually are lengthier. When you hear people talk about project, you're usually talking about something that can extend over a period of several weeks. I've also provided a good video for you on the Moodle, an example of an interdisciplinary project that's really part science, part language arts, and part technology. So take a look at that as well so you can walk through another sample STEM project. So the tool that we use to create the framework or the skeleton for one of these projects is called a GRASP framework. So let's walk through each part and make sure that you understand each part, because at some point in this week you're going to be actually completing one of these GRASP templates and come up with the framework for your own project. So let's start with the G in GRASP, and that is your goal or your educational outcome. Frequently, when we're talking about the goal, we're talking about a standard. So you're starting out with a standard from the Common Core as your focal point, and that's going to be your educational outcome for students. Now the next three here, role, audience, and scenario, you can kind of think of these together, but each part is critical. So from a scenario standpoint, that's the challenge, all right? So in my just past example, the challenge was solving the murder of the President of the United States. Now, they were taking on the role of attorneys. They were putting together a mock trial of Lee Harvey Oswald. And for an audience from that standpoint, they actually had a jury, and they did that mock trial in front of parents. So they had an audience, they had a role, and they had a scenario or challenge. Now, the product, the P here, or performance, in that JFK example, there were several products or performances. In the research phase, they were actually turning in their research and creating journals and keeping track, logging their research in. And then in the end, the final product or performance was, of course, their performance during the mock trial, as each team had an opportunity to call up various witnesses, whether it was Nikita Khrushchev or Fidel Castro or Jack Ruby or whoever else that they wanted to call up. Let's take a look at a second example, and one that's definitely a lot closer to STEM than my Who Shot JFK example. This was a project that I did in partnership with the Hackensack University Medical Center, and specifically the Cinzari Children's Hospital. So let's walk through the GRASP here. So this was basically a nutrition class. So you see our goal, we were working off a basic nutrition standard, analyzing the unique contributions of each nutrient class. And then in terms of role, audience, and scenario, students were assuming the role of food scientists here. And they were going to be creating original, what we call nutraceuticals. Nutraceuticals are functional foods. They're foods that serve some kind of purpose. And their audience here were pediatric oncology patients. So students were trying to create original food products that would address the very unique needs of pediatric oncology patients going through chemotherapy. The final product, they had several. They had actually create the food and actually prepare the food product and provide a written nutritional analysis as well as an oral presentation about their rationale behind the various ingredients in the food product and walking us through the nutritional analysis. And the final product of performance here was actually we had a tasting event at the hospital where the pediatric oncology patients got to taste the nutraceuticals. There's a lot of different ways to start creating a project. For me, what's always worked best is starting with the content. So starting with the standard that I want to work on, and then really understanding the standard in depth and coming up with a really good essential question. And I think that Who Shot JFK one is a good example. In the past, I've also done projects revolving around questions like what happened to the USS Maine. That was a U.S. naval vessel that mysteriously exploded in Havana Harbor in 1898. It was the spark of the Spanish-American War. That was an interdisciplinary project that I did with a physics teacher, where we looked at theories involving that the Maine could have actually spontaneously combusted due to the oxidation of coal dust. So we studied heat transfer theory and learned what happens, how coal dust oxidates in certain humidity situations. So I think, in front of you on the screen here, you see some sample essential questions for science and mathematics. But a good place to start really is with your standard or your educational goal, and then start with a really thought-provoking essential question. And sometimes that's a good start to build a project around that. Now, as we said, a lot of times with these projects, resources are a major concern, and it's definitely going to require you to maybe kind of go out of your comfort zone. You need a very diverse resource collection for these kind of projects, going beyond textbooks and handouts and things like that, working in the internet, using things like Skype to bring outside experts in. But I think in many ways, it's the resources that really bring this learning experience to life. Now, typically, when you think about projects, you inevitably think about technology. Although technology isn't an absolute necessity to create a great project, it definitely enhances the experience and allows the student to pick up some additional tools beyond just maybe the content that you're focusing on. So technology can serve several purposes in a project like this. Obviously, it can be used as a research tool, various electronic databases and multimedia sources. It can also be a great tool to collaborate with other human beings. We talked about Skype, and Skype is a great way to bring in outside experts, in a way that's very convenient for them. Technology can also be used as a way to present ideas, whether it's through PowerPoint, Prezi, or any other presentation tool. From a management standpoint, you can use a very simple tool like Microsoft Outlook has a task manager, and teach students how to use the task manager to organize their tasks and milestones and various benchmarks that they and the other people in their group may have to complete over the course of this 4, 5, or 6 week project. And last but not least, there are a lot of nice high-tech brainstorming tools like Webspiration or Coggle, which enable a student to kind of brainstorm in a group. So a lot of different ways that technology can work into a project like this. So in addition, when we talk about resources and technology, definitely remember that people can be some of the best resources you can find. This is a project that I did some time ago. We called it the Image FX project, and it basically was a project revolving around the concept of creating a business plan. So in this scenario, we forged a partnership with two companies, MetLife and Citibank. If you look at the picture here, you're seeing this is actually in one of MetLife's big conference rooms located in their headquarters in Jersey City, right on the Hudson River. So students here were presenting their business plans to a mock board of directors, which you see seated at the table, which were composed of their teachers as well as vice presidents from MetLife and Citibank. So in this scenario, these outside experts served not only as a resource throughout the project, and they definitely served as consultants to the students in the various aspects of the business plan development process, whether it be human resources and recruiting, or putting budgets together and securing capital, or doing a market analysis. These people were great resources and consultants for the students in that process. But also, as you see here, in the end, they were a great source of feedback and were a partner in the whole student assessment and evaluation process. This picture that you see here was actually a clip from NBC Nightly News shortly after September 11th. I had the opportunity to work on a project revolving around the concept of terrorism and how a society adapts to terrorism. In this situation, our partners were students from the Miklallet Ord High School in Jerusalem, and the students and the teachers there really were great consultants in helping us understand how terrorism impacts a society and how people deal with terrorism. And that partnership really was driven by video conferencing. So in finding partners, I'm sure you might be hearing about some of these partnerships and saying, it's somewhat challenging to put these things together, but it's not impossible. It does require work. It does require, in some ways, going above and beyond, but I definitely think it's worth the effort. Just some things to keep in mind that might help you be more successful in finding outside partners. Start out with the public sector. Nonprofit organizations, government agencies, these are people and organizations that really do revolve around the idea of helping as opposed to profit margin. So they may be able to make a little bit more time to help you than, say, the private sector. If you are dealing with a large organization, whether it be a corporation or a government agency, start with public relations or outreach departments. Many large companies or organizations have full-time people on staff whose sole purpose is to try to make connections with teachers like yourself. So do your homework first about the organization or company, and if they do have a PR department, start by reaching out to them first. Now, a lot of times people make the mistake when they reach out to partners of trying to impress the partner with how much they know about the particular focused topic of the project. I prefer playing what I call the helpless teacher card, where I don't really share everything I know about the topic, and I really express a real need for help. It works. People have a tendency to want to try to help people who are in need of help. So it's worked for me. I hope it works for you. You also have to be persistent. Very rarely have I been able to secure a partner on the first phone call or the first email. So it usually starts out with an email, and then it's a follow-up phone call a week or two later, and then I have to be prepared to be kind of bounced around from person to person. So persistence is key. Do not give up. And last but not least, be ready before you reach out to have the specifics as much as you can on the partner's role and responsibilities, time commitments, things like that. Particularly when you're dealing with the private sector, they really need to know up front what kind of time commitment and what do you need them to do, because that's going to play a major role in helping them figure out whether or not they can actually do this with you. One of the most challenging aspects of projects is, after you've actually created this grand design and you have your educational goal and you have this amazing essential question that you're going to build this project around, and students have a challenge and a scenario and an audience and all of that, then you start out, and sometimes the day-to-day becomes tricky because it doesn't kind of fall into place exactly like a traditional lesson plan. And you have to be very careful, because without a lot of structure day to day and without a lot of scaffolding, like you see in the pictures here, students can fall behind or drift off track very, very quickly. So you have to be sure that you're not just asking students to put together some grand product or performance and saying, okay, it's due in 5 weeks, and then not scaffold or break it down. So let's talk a little bit about a way to do that. So the best way for me to frame out the day to day and provide some kind of structure to the project after the challenge has been set is to go back and use that 4-phase inquiry based model. So let's walk through the Image FX project that I just talked about. That was the project that revolved around the business plan. This was for an apparel company that would be designing, manufacturing, and marketing sunglasses. And I'll show you how we use this inquiry-based model to kind of create some structure for the day-to-day. So in the first phase, engage, or the hook, we invited the CEO of City Street to come in, and we put the kids in the auditorium like you see here, and we asked him to give, I guess you'd call it a pep talk or a pitch, just the way if they were coming out with a new product line in his company, how he would motivate the staff to meet this challenge. So he came in and made like it was the real deal. Really motivated the students. As you see here, he has little mini Nerf footballs that he was throwing out to the students to get them excited about this new company, this new mock company they were creating called Image FX, and to get excited about this new apparel line of sunglasses. In the explore phase, we had students in groups. We had a human resources group, we had a finance group, we had an R&D group that was actually using CAD to design the sunglasses and 3D printers to actually print out prototypes. So this was the time where the students came together in the groups to figure out exactly what had to be done in order to create their part of the business plan. They worked closely with outside experts from the field in order to kind of point them in the right direction in terms of resources. And this was really about kind of developing what questions needed to be answered and then kind of rough draft answers of how their part of the business plan was going to be put together. Now, the explain phase for students was a reality check because this was the opportunity they had to share their rough ideas with the outside experts. And I have to say, some of the students were very excited about their ideas, but then when they shared them with people that actually are working in the field of marketing or finance or R&D, in some ways it was a major reality check. The one example that I could think of is we had our marketing group, and they were really excited about sharing their idea for a commercial and in kind of an ad campaign with this marketing executive. And I think the marketing executive was from Citibank. When they shared it and they were all done, the executive said to them, "Who's going to buy this?" And the students really didn't have an answer to that question. At that time, it was explained to them that promotion really is the front end of marketing. It's just one piece of it. But there's a whole nother back end in terms of identifying a market and studying a market and figuring out the demographics of who's going to buy your product first before you create a whole promotional campaign. So that was a very good learning experience for the students. And I think it's a good example of how this is the phase where all the creativity and all the energy of the students needs to be clarified, collated in a sense, and sometimes even corrected. And then in the extend phase is when students had to present their business plan. You see the picture here. I think I'm in the right-hand corner with a lot less gray hair, presenting their ideas to the mock board of directors. So this was the extension, the authentic application of everything they had been learning about human resources, R&D, finance, risk management, et cetera, et cetera. Now, another important tool for the kind of day-to-day is providing some type of benchmark calendar for students day-to-day. And there's a lot of different ways to do that. You'll see in this picture here, it's just a simple calendar, right? We're explaining to students working on this project each day kind of what their milestone should be and what they should get accomplished. Now, this probably should go hand in hand with some kind of contract that students sign where they actually sign off each day on what they're individually going to be responsible for to their team. And those milestones need to be checked. They can be checked by you, the teacher. They can be checked by maybe a manager that's elected in their project team, or maybe a combination of both. But the important thing is you must have day-to-day milestones or benchmarks, and they need to be assessed. This way, when a team is kind of falling behind, or when an individual is not pulling their weight, you as the instructor can identify that immediately and intervene accordingly. Okay, hopefully by now you understand the basics of what a project is, and what our GRASP tool is all about. You'll notice in your Moodle there'll be a GRASP template. I think I posted it as a forum for you to kind of use that GRASP template to put together a very, very basic skeleton for a unit project. So start with a standard. It could be one of the standards from the unit plan you put together, or it could be a total different piece of content that you're interested in. And work from there in terms of coming up with a scenario and a challenge and a product and a performance, et cetera, et cetera. Have fun with it.